Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Our theme is Cybersecurity Common Practices for Critical Infrastructure. Who's monitoring what? The webinar today is hosted by Nozomi Networks in collaboration with Keysight Technologies and Ampere Industrial Security. We hope to sift through all of the noise that you hear around industrial cybersecurity and find some signal consisting of available and practical techniques and tools to protect critical assets. I'm Eric Floyd, Director of Business Development at Keysight, and I'll be your moderator today. All audience members are muted, but you can use the Q&A or the chat function to ask questions, and we'll address as many of those as we can get to. The session will be recorded and available on demand from the Nozomi Network's website following the webcast. We're privileged today to have a distinguished panel of industrial cybersecurity experts. Like I said before, I know we have your full and undivided attention because there's nothing interesting happening outside of this webinar. So with that, I'll introduce our panelists or let them introduce themselves. So let's go to Patrick Miller first. Assuming your audio is working.
Yes. All right. Can you hear me? Great. I am getting a little network lag, so I hope I don't lag out too much. If needed, I might have to figure that out. Great. I'm Patrick Miller. I am CEO of Ampere Industrial Security, and regulation, background in mining, manufacturing, water, wastewater, chemical, gas, a lot of OT stuff. I've also been in it for some years as well. Next.
All right, thanks, Patrick. And we are having a little bit of difficulty with your connection. Let's go to Danielle Jablonski next.
Hi, y'all. Thanks to the partners today for having us all on and for all of the work that went into today's webinar. I am an OT cybersecurity strategist here at Nozomi Networks. I serve as an internal and external subject matter expert on OT and ICS security issues. I also handle government relations and special projects.
Thank you. And Ed Parkin from Keysight.
Hi. So Ed Parkin here. I'm the senior security architect for Keysight, and one of the projects that I lead is our around our manufacturing security and protection.
Great. Thanks, Ed. So as for me, I joined Keysight about 4 years ago. I'm responsible for network visibility solutions. We partner with network security and performance vendors to optimize the packet visibility data that they need for their tools. In the case of Nozomi, we're not only a partner, we're also a supplier of test solutions. We're a user of Nozomi's solutions, and we're even an investor in the company. So being new to the industrial cybersecurity market myself, I've been to a lot of conferences, webinars, read a lot, getting up to speed, and there's a lot of information out there. So I was reflecting on how to kind of simply understand the market. And I remembered when I joined Keysight, I met our CTO at our headquarters, and he taught me a little scientific or technology history lesson, which I thought kind of parallels what's happening in industrial cybersecurity. So if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, I'll share that story, and then we'll go to the panel. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so our CTO, Jay Alexander, we were just making small talk, and I mentioned that I was taking my family to London shortly thereafter, and he got very excited. I thought he would tell me to go see all the usual sites, but what he was really excited about was this picture here. That's the prime meridian at Greenwich Observatory. And that was a little curious to me. He said I should read a book before I go there called Longitude, or the true story of a lone genius who solved the greatest scientific problem of his time, is what it's called. So yeah, this was pretty interesting to me. Why would our CTO, who's supposed to be looking at 5G and AI and all these new technologies, Why would he care about what happened hundreds of years ago? Well, Keysight actually evolved out of Hewlett-Packard, and you probably think of HP as printers and servers and laptops, but the original HP that was invented in the garage was actually designed to measure audio waves and then electronic test signals. So this is the kind of solution that HP, which later became Keysight through a spinoff, really focuses on. It all comes down to accuracy and precision. So to the story of longitude, back in the 17th and 18th century, the European powers had ships that were bigger, faster, could carry more goods, more sailors. They had trade routes established in Asia, the Middle East, the Americas. They had maps that they were developing, a grid system that they developed for both longitude and latitude. There was one problem, however, which was safe navigation. So they were able to use astronomical charts in the sun to measure latitude, or their north-south position on a map like the one that we see here. However, they weren't able visually to measure longitude, so they couldn't tell where they were in an east-west sense. Well, what happened because of this, a lot of tragic shipwrecks, or even when they didn't wreck the ship, they'd often be afloat at sea, maybe 10 miles from their destination, but for weeks at a time, and they didn't have enough food or water for the crew. So lots of tragedy that happened because they didn't have accurate visibility. The government of England and some other competing rivals, that they set out a competition with cash prizes for somebody who could solve this issue of, how can you find out your east-west positioning, your longitude when you're out to sea. And what it came down to ultimately was being able to measure the time at your current location, which they could do by looking at the sun, but also measuring that relative to the time at their port, their home destination. And then the difference would indicate the number of degrees that you were apart. So obviously they had clocks at this time. They had pendulum clocks. So what was the problem? Well, when you took those clocks out to sea, the motion, the differences in temperature, corrosion from salt, air pressure, a variety of factors would throw off the accuracy of the clock to the point where you really have no idea where you are in the ocean. So a gentleman named John Harrison, who you probably haven't heard of, sorry, I thought I had a picture of him here. He wasn't Sir Isaac Newton or one of the giants of science that you've heard of. It was a more common man who was a carpenter named John Harrison. He developed the clock by using different materials like wood and what he called bimetallic strips. He altered some of the mechanisms. So instead of using pendulums, using balance wheels, just came up with practical ways to make a clock that could maintain its accuracy out to sea. And so that at first it was a very big unit like the one that you see to the left, and then they were able to come up with what they called sea watches. And ultimately this changed the course of history. Navigation and trade became safer, more secure. So you had a lot more goods and ships flowing. All right, so what does all that have to do with the development of industrial cybersecurity? I'm going to let Patrick Miller, assuming your connection is good now, thank you. I'm going to let you explain the parallels between these stories.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Eric, for the intro. I think parallel to OT cybersecurity, we didn't have a lot of, security in general, for that matter, in OT for a while. It was air-gapped, it didn't need it, it was really just about reliability. So we've changed over time in the same way. We've adopted new technologies, we've borrowed some things from IT. So in the same way as the clocks, we've grown and changed over time to match the need. I think kind of comparing the modern version of OT blend of IT mix. In some cases, it's really just technology, right? It's an IT looking box with an OT use. It would be, kind of the comparison of what we saw with the Sea-Watch, right? Where it gets smaller and kind of more accurate, for example. And I think that, for example, just the standardization process, right? I mean, this kind of method for navigation, right? We didn't need it. We had land. You didn't go very far. But once we started going further, we needed to have new methods and new techniques, and then kind of naturalized standardization. And then we even got things like Lloyd's of London insurance, came out of some of the same approaches as well. So a lot of this comparison is really interesting. But I also think that in the same way that we've borrowed a lot of the nautical technologies, I think we're kind of that the OT is borrowing a lot of the different technologies around it, in addition, to help it kind of transform and grow. And not the least of that is the topic of the day, INSM.
Okay, so yeah, we'll get to INSM in a little bit, which is otherwise known as east-west traffic. So a good parallel there. But yeah, thanks for that explanation. Let's go to Ed now. And Ed, can you tell me about what have been some of the challenges moving into OT security from IT security in a manufacturing company?
Sure. So thanks, Eric. So I think one of the first challenges we ran into was just a lack of visibility. Being from IT, we understood what our IT infrastructures were, but when we moved into the manufacturing space, we really had little idea understanding what the equipment was, what it did, what its purpose, what level of availability it needed, all those types of things. So we had to begin to get those inventories. So we started with manual inventories, but this is where we brought tools like Nozomi into place to begin to give us that real-time network level visibility. The next challenge was around processes and people, and really just trying to take technology that we were used to operating in an IT environment and meshing that with the way our manufacturing folks work. Because again, they're all about 365 being up, operating 24 hours a day. So how do we make changes? How do we work with people? Who do we work with? Because we have many, many, many different product lines, and they all have different schedules and different requirements. So it was learning that, and then language and technology and terminology. So we spoke different languages. In IT, we speak IT infrastructure, servers and VLANs and network components and subnets and those kinds of things. But in manufacturing, they think around products and product lines and deadlines and deliveries and those kinds of things. So we had to align those so that we could get together to make changes and understand the changes we were making on the same sets of infrastructure. And then the last was synchronizing our resources. We needed to make sure that when certain aspects of our manufacturing environment were ready to make some changes, we had the right IT folks available to make those changes. And we tend to do this kind of dance back and forth, because we've broken the project down into basically small little product line size increments so that we can work with just one product line at a time when we make changes. So those were some of the challenges initially.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, a lot of that reminded me of that challenge of getting clocks that were designed to work on land to work at sea. And so the same security that was designed for IT, but adapting that and making it work over on the OT.
Yep.
Okay, so what are some of the biggest gaps that still need to be bridged between OT and IT?
So one of the other areas was, in IT, we tend to live with cyber threat and constantly adjusting ourselves and adding capabilities. But in the OT space, very little understanding and really, kind of coming from a mentality of, well, we have a firewall and antivirus, so we're probably good, and helping them understand that the threat scape has changed continuously and has gotten much more aggressive. The manufacturing companies are in a target of ransomware actors and other types of threat actors. So helping them understand and bringing them along that journey so that they could work with us. Another area is old software. We have software that works. It just simply does the job that it needed to do, and it's been doing it for a long time. But we had to work with them to upgrade at least the OS level of the software so that we can support it and we can secure it. And then, like we were talking about with the watch, how do we adapt security tools intended for IT into the OT environment? And really, that was a lot of process tweaking to make sure that it functioned the way that it needed to, and frankly, didn't break things. So we had to be very vigilant about when we turned things on to make sure that we didn't suddenly stop a production line from working. Developing access controls. Again, it kind of goes back to, well, you're inside the company, everything's fine, right? And we're like, no, not so much anymore. The new threats and the new security paradigms require us to bring down the level of containment and segmentation down to a product line level. So it was implementing those control processes and working with them to help them understand why and what it meant. And then the last was really hooking up our incident response processes with manufacturing, because again, we have dozens of lines around the world, and if we detect something is amiss, who do we call? Who do we contact? What do we do about it? Do we just cut it off from the network? Well, maybe, but then you've got a process that's running or that should be running that suddenly isn't. So it's really getting all of those contacts down to the individual station level and being able to work with them to remediate the issue and put the production device back in line. So those were some of the key gaps that we had to really close. And again, it really came down to people and process more than technology for the most part.
Great. Thanks, Ed. So Danielle, let's turn to you and build on what Ed was just talking about there. What do you see as some of the nuances surrounding incident response in industrial settings?
Yeah, a lot of good nuggets so far, and I'll pull out some and tease some others. So I think that there are a lot of bad analogies in OT cybersecurity. We as security practitioners have to remind ourselves that we're not talking to other security people all day. And I think we really get caught up in that cycle sometimes. And I don't mean we on this call, I just mean we across the industry. So other poor analogies, other than some that we see in IT, include things like cyber insurance, right? Especially when we talk about incident response. A lot of people like to say, kind of like insurance, we hope to not have to use it, but it could be a use it or lose it or a pay more for it type of scenario. None of those have to be true, right? We hope that you don't have a broad scale incident that you need to call in one of our partners for. And in that hope, it's not that just we hold out hope, we invest in professional services to help you use tools better every single day to prevent worst case scenarios. So when we're talking about industrial incident response, Ed mentioned processes and people. And I joked about this yesterday. I saw this on Twitter. I don't see asset owners struggling to get security right. I see individual leaders tasked with responsibility and accountability for security, either being set up for success or failure. And that devil is in the details and it's in the resources. So these are resource dependent personnel problems that we see people getting wrong. It's not this nebulous asset owner just doesn't understand security and the threat landscape and things like that. So when we talk about incident response, I think number one, the scenario matters. And that means for preparedness. I actually heard somebody say that the scenario doesn't matter for an incident response training for a tabletop exercise. I think that's really silly. I think that the scenario is really paramount for you avoiding worst case scenarios and understanding how to map your outputs from your security program to reducing the severity of impacts. That's something I say over and over again. You've probably heard me say it anytime I've ever spoken. So when we talk about compliance, people often joke that we're checking boxes to have some compliance measures. We're not actually doing security. We see the same things translate for incident response. We're kind of checking the boxes that according to our plan saying, yep, we did the plan. Eric was the guy to call and we called Eric. But we don't see people planning to failure. One that I point out in a lot of IR conversations, I did one for RSA last year, a virtual OT day was, in my opinion, most of incident response planning is ego management. People don't want to have that conversation, right? But there's a lot of leaders in the room. There's a lot of decisions to be made. And at the end of the day, if we're talking about people, processes, and outputs, the people being number one, they can be set up for success or failure, but also the mechanisms of coordinating response can break down because of ego management. So it's something I just like to highlight. And then beyond that, you can focus in a lot on your incident response, looking at misconfiguration issues and context-specific areas for exploitation, which won't be revealed by focusing on available cyber threat intelligence alone. So that's another gap that I see when people go to plan for IR. They look at available CTI and then they try to back map that to their actual environment. It should be the reverse, right? You should look at your own context, your own environment, your own potential for exploitation, and then consider how an actor might impact you based on kind of what I call effects-based rather than means-based analysis of your IR. And then finally, one other thing I like to call out is that we don't want to see people buying tools and technologies and then setting and forgetting those solutions. I joked last week that solution is the #1 lie in cybersecurity because there is no such thing as a fix. And solution is synonymous with a fix. So there are no solutions, there are only partnerships. And so we partner with people to enhance our data. We invest in professional services to make sure you can use the tools better. And we work with you to build better incident response planning so that you do know who to call, when, why, and how. You can work through those established requirements. And again, back to not focusing on security practitioners alone. I met a guy last week. We think of either security people or process control engineers as being the experts. This guy's been at his water purification and manufacturing place for over a decade, started as a painter. He is the quintessential person we want to see in the role of OT cybersecurity expert, the person asking to be set up for success. And we often ignore that persona in these conversations. And I was like, you're incredible, man. Like, you're the guy that everyone wants to meet and talk about and know, that has put in these 20 years and now is reaching out for help on how do I get this right? How do I set myself up for success? And how do I convince my CISO to buy the right tools, right? Another conversation, but that's a relationship management conversation as well.
Thanks, Danielle. I thought Patrick nodding and smiling a lot, so I think it resonates with him. I liked your tale about the painter because I just talked about a carpenter who helped solve a big problem as well. So great parallels. Patrick, I'm going to turn to you, and we mentioned INSM monitoring previously, but can you explain a little bit more in detail what that is, and then how does that fit into the overall security control set for an industrial organization?
Sure. And nod to Danny. That is awesome. The ego management component. That is so well said. Just hallelujah on that one. That's so true. Okay, on INSM is Internal Network Security Monitoring, and this is a term thrown around by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. There are a lot of other names. They just used this one. It's basically monitoring the east-west traffic inside of your control network in this particular case. So it doesn't have to be, a control network. It can be any network segment or zone that you've got, and you want to monitor the traffic as it goes back and forth inside there, not necessarily crossing like a firewall boundary or a perimeter. So for this context, FERC has an order, it's order 887 if you're interested, that basically says you have to monitor in your NERC SIP, regulated spaces, the traffic inside the network. And it contains things like, internal network security monitoring is knowing who's talking to who, like a network baseline, knowing when new devices are added. And how does this fit into your overall picture? I mean, honestly, NERC SIP's not great, but it's a pretty good job at covering the electric sector, at least. And as a model for other sectors, it's often used. But they cover, like you have to have a perimeter, you have to segment your networks, you have to have physical boundaries. You actually have to secure the devices inside that network with things like antivirus and have a software baseline and change control configuration management. A lot of the work has already been done. So what's left? Well, pretty much what's left is, for example, if you have a malicious insider, or you have someone either accidentally or on purpose sending commands to control systems that would harm the system, for example, like stop commands to PLCs and this kind of thing. They're legitimate commands, right? But at the wrong time or under the wrong circumstances, they can have pretty catastrophic effects. So what they're looking for is a way to detect that last bit, right? So what this is basically saying is, if you've gone this far, your program is fairly mature, you've done most of the blocking and tackling, and now we're looking for that residual risk component, the leftover stuff of, the anomalous behavior inside the network as you go back and forth between systems.
All right, thanks, Patrick. And Danielle, I know that Patrick just talked about FERC, which really only applies to the electric sector. So what other standards or frameworks are there that folks can follow, and where does monitoring fit in there? I'm thinking of NIST in particular.
Sure. So everyone knows the NIST kind of categories, but identify, protect, detect, and respond. I think if you marry protect and detect together, that still equates to prevention. As Patrick mentioned, and others kind of are blue in the face over, perimeter security is no longer good enough for prevention. We understand that. Prevention is still more important, though, than response, right? You want to be able to do better prevention and less response, and that looks different for everybody. But I think every risk management program across any different kind of guidance or regulation or recommendation shares one goal. And it's one I've already mentioned, which is to reduce the severity of impacts. I joked a while ago that people put detection above prevention. I think that's a misnomer. Prevention reduces risk by addressing opportunities for attackers to access your organization, right? So as threats continue to be identified, the only way to detect their presence is to have that visibility into your operations. I think everyone knows that that's why we're here today. So the NIST CSF, sorry about that. The NIST CSF is a great starting point, but organizations may or may not know of another publication that came out of NIST known as the 800-82 document. The revision 3 came out in April of 2022, and it's actually a guide to operational technology, and it highlights the need for continuous monitoring in a vendor agnostic way, but it does equate detection to continuous monitoring. And it also includes, in managing OT security risks, a note that says there must be a continuous process where all components have ongoing activities for security. And so that encourages organizations to build out continuous monitoring as a strategy. I think that's a better starting place for most organizations that don't have the resources to go and harmonize all of the available best practices, guidance, compliance, 6443, NIST, CPGs, right? It's really difficult. But if you do want to hone in on a strategy, I think continuous monitoring is a great place to start. I guess the other thing I would say is in that draft as well, we could talk about this broadly, but also as it applies to the INMS, internal network monitoring systems. There are new models emerging in this field, and those are looking at not just scanning and hunting for communications anomalies, but building baselines and driving context-specific cybersecurity. So there are tools that are purpose-built, right, in this industry. Eric, you mentioned being a little bit newer to OT. Some people might not realize that we've continued to build on this for years and years. And so we have things called process anomaly detections. And this is where the industry is driving forward. It's marrying communications anomalies with process anomalies in flow parameter, temperature, et cetera, to really understand, it's machine learning, but the key benefit is what I call building intuition into monitoring. So there's your starting place of scanning, right? There's the known knowns, the known unknowns, then there's anomaly detection, but we're moving forward in this continuous monitoring to understand how to marry the two to detect things like solar winds, right? Patrick just called it residual risk. I think that is a little bit desensitizing, actually. I think it's more than residual risk. I think it is early warning in a sense. And I think that that's really where the industry is going. And so I know you asked, what standards are out there. There's a lot of them. I'm happy to talk through one at a time. But when it comes to harmonizing them, it's really difficult. And so I actually point people instead to picking a strategy to build out, and continuous monitoring is really a great strategy to be ahead of the curve, regardless of the available threat intelligence, regardless of the known signatures you can hunt for, and regardless of, where your program stands today in terms of funding or available tools, et cetera.
Great. Thank you very much. So monitoring is key. And again, Patrick, you've talked about east-west traffic monitoring, or INSM. So what are some challenges as an organization tries to implement that?
Yeah, and first I'd like to not take a little bit off of what Daniel said is the benefit to this goes far beyond security. Once you get this level of, well, I like the term intuition, right? You understand your process in a way that is far, far better. I've seen when you implement things like INSM in a network, the security benefit, honestly, there's not a lot of security events in these networks. Most of them are fairly well protected unless you're connected to the internet. All bets are off. But if you're actually networks, if your networks are segmented and they're protected, there's not a lot of security events in these networks. What we do see is process events at the same time. You actually get a bigger operational benefit in a lot of cases. That's kind of the value add. But yeah, that process intuition is just tremendously useful. Some of the challenges I see, honestly, in this, it is just these networks were not really designed this way at all in the beginning. They were not designed to do this. So, for example, you've got to be able to aggregate the traffic on the network in a way where you can see all of the east-west traffic. So this is, in some cases, it's going to be things like span ports on a switch. That's typically where people start. Switches, depending upon their age, are not really don't do this well. So things like taps are certainly a much better idea because it's purpose-built, it does the thing. But in most cases, the biggest challenge I see is you often have to re-architect the network. And re-architecture of the network to do this usually means an outage for a network. So network outage in a facility that needs to be running all the time, that has the dreaded words of unscheduled outage. No one wants that. So you work around that. The biggest challenges is basically planning to get it done. So you've got to get all the resources lined up, do all of your testing. If you're lucky enough to do this on a greenfield or brand new network, great. But most of the time you're retrofitting this onto something legacy for obvious reasons. So those legacy networks typically have to have some changes there. So in addition to, of course, implementing the technology, learning the technology, getting it tuned, that comes secondary to just getting the network designed in such a way that this can be done.
Great, thank you, Patrick. So we'll go back to Ed. And Ed, you already talked some about the challenge of upgrading software, but I think Patrick was even talking about hardware there in the manufacturing environment. So maybe you can comment on that. And then as a follow-on question, how do you measure progress in reducing the security risk in the OT environment?
Yeah, so we've been on this journey for several years, and I was always getting that very question: how do we know we're getting better? So I worked with a couple of manufacturing managers to come up with a scoring matrix that aligns with the work streams that we broke the processes down. So we have multiple manufacturing sites, and they are in one, sort of think of them as the column where all of the sites are. And we even break them down to individual product lines. So a given site might have 15 or 20 different product lines through that. But then we take that and we apply it to our control work streams. So one is our enterprise control. So what are we doing across the entire enterprise that benefits manufacturing, because manufacturing sits within the broader enterprise? An example of that is simply something like our anti-malware email security, because it benefits, and that's one way that the bad guys get in. But then we worked on a network work stream, and again, we apply that across the product lines, and then endpoint, and then server and applications, and then finally our processes for testing, remediation, and recovery. And I put those into a matrix, gave each area a score where it crossed over. And so let's say network segmentation might have 2 or 3 different buckets in it with 3 or 4 or 5 points of score. And then as we roll out the capabilities, we just score against that. So maybe it's a 2 out of 5 at one point, but by next month, it'll be a 3 out of 5 because we've either applied it to more breadth across our manufacturing environment or deeper sets of controls. So that's one way, which is the scoring matrix. But others are, it's just simply penetration testing. I run that program and I point them in our manufacturing areas in a very, very controlled way so that they don't interrupt something that, doesn't need to be interrupted. But we get a lot of great feedback because we hire people that are very, very good at what they do, and they can find holes. So that gives us a lot of guidance in what areas we need to focus in. And then we're also trying to implement some level of continuous testing. Keysight makes a solution that allows us to kind of point it at firewalls or point it at endpoint security or a number of different security tool types. And we can run those tests continuously to make sure that we're keeping up with what it needs and whether there's a new attack by a new attack group. And we can point that at a device and see if we're vulnerable to that type of an attack. And then the last part is just I kind of call it vulnerability management, but it's more than that because it's not just about patching vulnerabilities, because you can quickly run out of patchable vulnerabilities because there is no software, there is no patches, that's not a route that you can take. So we always make sure that we marry that with exploitability. Just because there's a vulnerability doesn't mean it's exploitable. So a lot of times we have to work both levers, try to reduce the attack surface by going after vulnerabilities, but also shrinking the exploitability of certain types of attacks. And we do align them with the specific attack types, again, that we might see in a pen test. Oh, they came this way or they came that way. And we try to align those securities against that.
All right, thank you. We do have a few questions from the audience. So I'll go to the first one from Dick Brooks, and I'm not sure who wants to answer it, so I'll read it out and I'll let you guys decide. But does software supply chain risk management, or NIST SP 800-161, have a place in OT risk management?
So I was just on the side while Ed and Pat were talking, I was looking up some other resources on this one. I've addressed this at an Atlantic Council panel, but two things. So what Ed and Patrick and I have been saying so far is really this needle in a haystack problem, right? If there aren't that many security events, we still have to marry, how do we detect known vulnerabilities and do signature hunting and fit these things into the MITRE ATT&CK framework? So then you see the opposite kind of strategy take hold where they focus on vendor security. Vendors do batch sample security testing, but they can't control the chain of custody or the full security life cycle, after the product ships. So the same technologies like we've talked about can be purpose-built. They are deployed in several different ways, and those configurations and use cases are so specific that they then dictate the severity of any potential security gaps and flaws within your organization. So that comes back to the needle in a haystack problem. And so the question that came in on supply chain risk management, the document the NIST document that points to, that one does mention continuous monitoring almost 70 times. But that document is a beast, right? It's huge. It's hard to implement. It's hard to understand. It's hard to digest, not by design, right? But it's trying to help the whole community move forward. There's another document that CISA put out, defending against software supply chain attacks. And I point people to this tiny little side box on page 11 in the document. And it's called Resilience, Some Simple Steps. And I actually think these steps are so brilliant for supply chain management. If you don't know where to start, just find this one little box on this paper. And it says, number one, pre-identify and establish alternative suppliers for the critical software you use. Have plans in place to switch to a new supplier if feasible. That's supply chain 101, right? Redundancy. Number two, this is my favorite. Use your understanding of how software supports critical business or mission functions to identify failover processes and workarounds in the event that functionality with specific software becomes unavailable. We've been doing this in OT for a long time, especially on the hardware side. This is crown jewel analysis. They're just taking that to the software side, but that is critical step number two in any kind of, supply chain program. And then within that, it says, prepare and document your plans for process failure, for exercising to failure, like I mentioned on incident response, periodically conduct tabletop exercises, like I mentioned, the scenario matters. And then the last one, where possible, coordinate these processes with your vendors and external stakeholders. So it really brings it full circle. So I don't mean to detract from the NIST document, but there's another one out there if it's a little bit easier to digest. It's only 16 pages long, but I'll let the guys jump in too.
Good. And Danielle, any chance you can type that one into the chat? I got page 11, but the name of the document escapes me at this point.
Yeah, I'll add one more to that, and great one, Danielle. That's a good one. A little bit dated, but it's still very useful. Is the old DHS SCADA procurement language. It's lighter weight than anything NIST. NIST is great. It's very thorough at the same time, but it's also got a lot of thud factor. It's thick and weighty and hard to get through. So if you need to just get going and you need something lightweight, there's a lot of options that are more custom tailored or fit to OT.
Okay. The second question, I was actually about to ask Danielle. Mark Febro has said that Patrick can knock this one out of the park, so maybe both of you again. But basically saying INSM has been around for a long time, just called other things, especially as it pertains to using behavior in production systems to identify plausible kill chains. Specific to level 1 and 2 communication and control, how do you optimize anomaly detection to ensure intelligence collected is actually useful in the context of both engineering determinism and the design basis of the actual system being protected? So that's a very long question. Hopefully you can address that.
Yeah, and I think the follow-on piece there, thanks, Mark, and I don't get to see you, but thanks for being on the webinar. It's been a while. Yeah, and as you mentioned, failure to do so often leads to overwhelming data analysis problems. So in this, basically, you've got to start with, what's the most important stuff. You can't do this for everything right away, right? You got to kind of stage it out, crawl, walk, run approach. So specific to level 1 and 2 communication and control, the only way to optimize is you have to know your system. Like in a lot of cases, if these things have been built by merger and accretion or grown over time, or you've gone through M&A, you don't have a lot of kind of that gray beard analysis or the legacy knowledge, then it's going to be more challenging. It's going to take a lot more analysis up front. I've seen a lot of inherited systems where this becomes a big problem. So just, as Daniel mentioned earlier, that crown jewel analysis component, you need to know what the most important things are and then start there. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, and follow on to Danielle. What is really new about the new FERC proposal, and do you think it's a good model?
Yeah, I do think it's a good model because it does point to what's on the horizon for the whole industry. And it does so in, again, a vendor agnostic way, which does say we have to marry all of this data and use it to to our advantage against the threat landscape that changes all the time. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the acronym DRIP, data rich, information poor environments. That is the case across every critical infrastructure sector. And so, like I said, marrying kind of the process anomaly data to the communication stuff is very important. But what's more important is that the tools you use are purpose built for OT networks and understanding industrial protocols, right? That's number one, that's paramount. We use this word visibility a lot. A lot of the times visibility is you can't protect what you can't see. It's also that you can't do root cause analysis of anything. So again, we're extending your ability to do root cause analysis based on purpose-built understanding of your ecosystem. So at Nozomi, in our product, we have a couple of different ways that we do that. You guys are familiar with our product, but for those who aren't, we have different protect modes that really dictate how paranoid you are with your alerts. So if you want to be hyper paranoid, you're going to deal with a lot of alerts every day, and you're going to have to, address those events as they come up, right? That's triage 101. But that doesn't have to be your starting point, right? You can start with known vulnerabilities, like I mentioned. You can then introduce signatures and malware kind of hunting, right? From different rules, snort and YAR, the things that are out there. But the other thing that we have is something called smart polling. So when we get a little bit more advanced away from the known knowns, you can actively interrogate systems on your network if you want to understand a little bit more about your crown jewels, for instance. And we can do that in a way that, again, works with the industrial protocols and doesn't brick your assets. And so I really like the word in the question that was determinism, because again, you're using purpose-built tools to attack randomness. And that's what we don't talk about enough. And that is really what's different about continuous monitoring that works with both types of data, communications and process anomalies, is that you're reducing randomness, right? If you're understanding more and you're using available data to underpin all of the actions that you take in your security program, you're limiting the potential for randomness. And that's what most cyber attacks look like, right? In your operation, in your communications data, an anomaly means something is out of ordinary, right? That's what the definition of an anomaly is. And so that's what's changing. That's what's moving forward. And Patrick mentioned that, NERC isn't great, but what they've done a really great job of is understanding the effects that happen in their environments and who they impact. And I think that's the part that other sectors struggle with, right? Other sectors can't easily identify what the bulk of their risk is in terms of assets. NERC does that really well. And I think that it's a leading model, being able to, kind of be on the cutting edge of what technology is available and understand the effects that they're trying to prevent, right? The severity levels that they know would be worst case scenarios. They continue to move as far away from those scenarios as they really can.
Thank you. So Ed, I want to come back to you because we've been talking about NERC a little bit, which is electric sector, but I know for other sectors like manufacturing, there isn't really a compliance concern there. So what drives Keysight in terms of going after its cybersecurity posture for OT?
Yeah, I would agree. There isn't really anything specific for manufacturing, but we do look at everything. So Danielle mentioned 171. We also look at the Carnegie Mellon maturity model, the recent national cybersecurity strategy that came from the White House. We just keep our eye on all of this stuff, mainly to glean it for ideas and say, oh, like the one that Danielle brought up about, oh, we hadn't really thought about that. So let's figure out how we put that into either our policies for what we should be doing and dictate, or capabilities or processes. So we're constantly looking at that. But I think the big drivers for us started with really the ransomware threat. When I started looking at this project, ransomware was more about individuals. Oh, I've compromised your PC. I need whatever, hundreds of dollars. Then it moved into healthcare, and then it moved towards manufacturing. And then it got more and more serious with the threat actors being far more sophisticated and even breaking their industry into various components. So we kept our eye on that, saying these threats are getting more and more difficult to detect, more and more difficult to prevent. So that was a big area that drove us is not wanting to be one of those victims. Another is just in general best practices. We meet with a lot of peers and have lots of discussions around what are you guys doing? How are you finding this? How are you addressing this issue? So that becomes a big part of what moves us, our overall risk model for the company. You know, what is moving us and how does manufacturing fit with other aspects of risk for the company? And then the one that came up probably 2, maybe 3 years ago was cyber insurance. And Danielle, you mentioned this before. This is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And we've seen the requirements to requalify every year become bigger and bigger. To last year, manufacturing had its own section that I had to work with our manufacturing folks to answer the questions and again, use that as guidance saying, okay, this is what's coming next year. So we better be better prepared for it when it comes around. And then the last is our customers. Keysight does a lot of business with a lot of customers that actually put in cybersecurity requirements into their purchase orders. So if we're not following up with what they're asking for, then you know, they may not buy from us. So that is a big deal and a big driver for us as far as, you know, pushing security into our manufacturing OT environments.
Thank you. All right, we'll take another question from the audience from Christopher Cook. And I'm not sure who this is to again. I'll let you guys decide, but do you know if anyone is looking at or has started using a modern full stack observability platform? And it just got cut off for me. Patrick, I know you were in the process of answering, so if you can complete.
No. I want someone from Nozomi to answer that one.
Okay.
It disappeared for me. Is it in the
Yeah,
answer?
it did for me
It's in the
too. Once I
answer.
was reading it.
Yeah, it's in the answered,
Who was it from?
isn't it?
So I love the term full stack because again, it means something different to everyone. But I don't know if anyone saw the ARC rollout that we did that has more active, you know, capability. The real question around that is really firewall configuration and who's willing to break with the boundaries. So again, it's Patrick jokes about this in his consulting firm where the answer becomes it depends. The answer is always it depends. It depends on the network and what data and what's like, you know, what crown jewels you have. So Patrick, maybe you have a broader perspective, but for us, it really becomes about cross boundaries and directionality. It's one of the reasons we did roll out ARC, which is our kind of endpoint solution, but I don't want to be a commercial. So let's let Patrick and not Nozomi put that out there.
Yeah. Okay. So short answer is yes. And I think what we're seeing in a lot of cases is we're spending a lot of money on a lot of different security tools, and we're seeing marginal value from a lot of overspend and tool overlap. And frankly, we set this, you just buy it and it's blinky lights and it's a space heater somewhere in a data center at some point because you didn't train on it and you didn't implement it well and you're not using it. So short answer is yes. Done well, you don't have to have that same problem. And it takes a lot of companies some kind of self-reflection to decide which technologies are willing to cut and which ones are willing to use better, and talk to your vendors to help you use those in new and creative ways. But the short answer is yeah. The ability to integrate a bunch of stuff into one of these tools is pretty high. So it just depends on your level and your desire to integrate a bunch of things into another tool. So yeah.
Another question that Patrick, you did answer in the chat, but we can share with the audience. What would be the principles for the organization that's embarking on the journey of OT security? Yeah,
and if you're just getting started, first of all, awesome, great. I'm glad you're on this path. So cheers. But probably the easiest one I've seen to pick up and run with is the SANS 5 critical controls. It's 5 things. They're big bucket items. I mean, they're not like small little bits, right? They're bigger conceptual things, but that's a good. I mean, from what we've seen, and I am an instructor for SANS, so I'm not just plugging the organization. I do believe in it as well. But these are the things that we're seeing that are actually like the critical things you should be doing. So if you're not doing these 5 things, try to do these 5 things. get going on it, right? As quickly as you can, as good as you can.
We could marry this question to Dick Brooks' question as well about kind of where to start. Nozomi has its own list of like top 5 things you have to do. It always starts with network segmentation, but I think folks, especially Dick and others, understand that to be true. What I love to tell people, and it's a little controversial, but I like it anyway, is that you have no trusted advisor in this space because everyone has a stake in the pie. Even security competitors that aren't the same tool compete for the same funds. Consulting firms and partnerships have their own interests at play. They have their own partners, right? And so I tell everyone that you have to be your own trusted advisor. And I finally saw this taken into account last week. So I was at the CS4CA conference in Houston. I had a friend of mine who's just a friend from an electric utility from my hometown, not a Nozomi customer, who's given me a tour, talked about the tool, talked about the capabilities out there. And he actually put out a call to other practitioners and end users to tell him at the utility what they like and why that's out there, what the pitfalls they've seen, the challenges, the tuning issues, the most sophisticated features rather than kind of the baseline features that competitors have. And that's excellent because that person is taking on being their own trusted advisor. And I've seen people set up for either success or failure. That's really what you have to do. You can't burden shift this to a partner or a consultant. It's great to have them and they're going to be very useful and worth the expenditure. But at the end of the day, you have to dictate and decide what's best for your organization, your environment. And none of these recommendations are going to help you do that. I call it a literature review, asking for other people's intel and kind of a groundswell of Gartner pure insights, right? That takes a little bit more work, but the due diligence is on you to understand that. And then also, I do think that the CPGs can be useful here only because they're not a one size fits all. And people have given systems some flack for that in that they don't have deterministic outcome-based metrics, but they do provide 4 different ways you can approach getting things done and doing things over time, which we all know, security programs aren't beholden to one fiscal year. They don't have specific CapEx and OpEx considerations that are the exact same for every organization. And so you can approach it with a criticality mindset. You can approach it with a budget in mind. You can approach it in a crown jewels way. And so I do think that is a good one for organizations just starting out to be able to pick up the ball and run with it. Again, it's not outcome based, but it is productive, right? And I think that's really the key in what you buy and how you use it is it productive for your program, right? Not just does it check the box that you need it to check.
Yeah, I can add a little to that. Thank you, Danielle. Then first off, the nod to the CPGs. The DHS cyber performance goals, it's a great place to start. And it was designed with measurement across multiple different industry verticals. It was originally implemented or designed to be implemented for water, wastewater, chemical, gas, and electric. So it's a common baseline. You must be this tall to ride the ride across these 5 infrastructures. So it's designed good enough in a way that makes it very useful for kind of whatever industry you're in. But to Dick's specific question, everybody wants to pit NIST against 62443. This is not, frankly, a measuring contest for the standards. The standards are what they are. I mean, I'm Italian. This is Italian food. It's all the same ingredients. You just mix it up a different way and you call it something else. Controls are controls. Sometimes 2 controls mean 1 in a different standard. Honestly, just pick one that feels good for you. And the main thing is use it. I don't care which one you use. I don't care what it is. Just pick one and start measuring against it. And if you measure consistently, then you'll learn more and you'll figure out if this is a good one or not. But the main thing is just grab one. If it feels good, apply it, and then apply it regularly and measure yourself against it, and you'll figure it out. But there really isn't one better than the other. Just take your pick. I don't care which one you choose.
Sounded like ego management that you talked about.
Yeah.
And Ed, are you jumping in? Because if not, I have one other thing I like to tell people.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
So one other thing that I like, so 62443 is great. It's wonderful. For nerds, it's excellent. But one of the first things I said is security practitioners in OT typically aren't speaking to other security nerds in OT. And that's just the reality. But a thought exercise I like, so I mentioned, literature review. I mentioned making sure that you're your own trusted advisor. One other thing I like to tell organizations is set audacious goals. People hate that term because it seems unrealistic if it's audacious. But if you set an audacious goal that's tied to a real world outcome, I learned this in my first job and I've used it ever since, then you bank on that real world outcome and you can then measure yourself against that goal you've set that's tied to a real world outcome. If that real world outcome is incorporating every single 62443 standard, there's hundreds of them, and you're not going to be able to do anything else. Therefore, you're giving yourself kind of the leeway to ignore the other available options, but you have an outcome in mind and you can measure against it. And it's a real world outcome. It's not a pipe dream. Otherwise, I think, you could set something like we want to ensure that our crown jewel assets are hardened against cyber attacks. And you can measure against that using all of these available documents and resources. So I think that thought exercise is warranted. I think it's very useful and worthwhile. Set an audacious goal, write out what the real world impact is. And if you can then tie that to a timeline, you are so far ahead of so many other organizations if you timestamp that goal.
Thanks. And yeah, so Ed, anything you wanted to add?
I think the bottom line for us is just start. When we started this project, we picked one manufacturing line in one site, and we just started. And a lot of it was, I walked in with, sort of a holster full of a bunch of technologies that I wanted to throw at this situation. And I quickly walked away just realizing how silly that was, that it really came down to understanding what it was they did, understanding the world of manufacturing and what their drivers were, and taking a step back and then going, okay, let's throw almost all of these out and let's just start with something, and building those relationships, building a sense of trust that even though we were from IT and not part of manufacturing, we could be trusted to help them do what they needed to do, and vice versa. So, really just get started. And then I like Danielle's idea of set an ambitious goal. If you don't hit it, that's fine. Don't look at what you didn't hit. Look back at what you did hit, because you probably went far more than you thought you would if you'd have set a safe goal, right? Because you would have dialed it back a little bit and, maybe dumbed it down a little bit, maybe not been as far or as challenged as you could. And you'll also rally some other resources around that too, because then people will go, well, I'm competitive. Well, I'm competitive too. So let's see if we can hit these other things. So again, I'm all about just getting started, move forward, and do something effective every day.
Great. So it looks like we have two more unanswered questions. Probably have time for one. So if you can take a look and pick
The recovery question, because I think it's a good takeaway.
I think so too. Yeah.
I'll be short and sweet. I think people are really cautious about picking out one portion of the OT/IR cycle that's more important than another. I'm sorry, I don't agree. Containment is the number one most important IR kind of specification when it comes to recovery. It's going to be different for every single organization. But when we talk about cyber recovery and OT environments, containment, you can't isolate systems all the time. You can't take things offline if you want to, disrupt services or resources that are critical to a population. And so what I think we need in the industry is more fallout analysis based on locality, right? It's not just the biggest players. Some things impact rural populations and cities very differently. But I think what we can do is really focus in on that containment piece when you're going through your planning.
Yeah, I would add recovery. I mean, test your incident response plan all the way to loss, to recovering the systems. If you didn't test it that far, then you didn't really test it.
Yeah, I would agree. You got to be able to show that you've recovered whatever it is you've lost, and just thinking that you did may leave you sadly surprised at the other end.
Yeah, and I think a lot of companies have had the tough lesson of ransomware.
Yeah, and SolarWinds.
And SolarWinds, yeah.
All right, we're about out of time. Emily, we'll follow up with your question offline. And thanks everybody for your great questions. I hope this was a valuable session. I know I learned a lot. And again, going back to that original analogy of, trying to solve that longitude problem, I think in industrial cybersecurity, it can get very overwhelming and seem like an audacious challenge, as Danielle has said, but I think there's a lot of practices, tools, techniques available today. And like Ed said, just getting started, picking one of those frameworks to start with. And then we now have this ability or this requirement, even in some cases, to look at the east-west traffic as well as the north-south, which we were previously already looking at for detection and protection. So any closing thoughts? Patrick, I'll let you.
Get started. It's going to take you longer than you think. I can't tell you about it. It's just you're going to run out of time. You're going to run out of available resources to help you, because everyone's going to be doing this at all the same time. All the infrastructures are being asked to do this at the same time. Get started now. Start planning, figure out what you need, and get this in your chain. You're going to have to do reviews on the hardware you purchased, the people that are going to need to do the work. It's just going to take you more time than you think. So get busy.
All right. Ed, did you want to add or?
I was just going to say, you know, along with that line, find a friend. So someone in some part of your organization, in your manufacturing or in your OT environment that you can work with, that is willing to try some things with you, willing to let a couple things fail and grow with that, and then take that success to the next friend. That was kind of how we did it and built a little bit of a positive reputation around what we were trying to do, as opposed to just kind of blindly going in and picking the biggest one and just kind of doing that. We just found someone that was willing to work with us.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for joining today. And with that, we'll wrap up the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.